Imagine reaching 60 at the point where the body enters contention with the will, while memory, desire, and public dignity move according to different temporal orders and seek a difficult accommodation. Add to that the pressure of a nation in upheaval, where revolution unsettles civic life, inherited loyalties pass into strain, and new institutions emerge through argument, coercion, and bloodshed. Under such conditions, the governing question concerns mental and artistic coherence. By what means does a poet preserve the gathered shape of thought when history presses inward? Age registers itself in the flesh, memory returns with increasing authority, and art continues to demand mastery. That is the pressure under which I begin today's lecture, and it is the pressure that leads me into The Tower, the 1928 volume in which Yeats brings age, history, and artistic will into a relation at once severe, exacting, and dynamically unsettled. I approach the book through three words: stone, spiral, sovereignty. These function here as orienting terms because they make available, from the outset, a precise account of the unusual concentration that marks Yeats's late style. The title, The Tower, names a building in the plain architectural sense, yet within the imaginative economy of the volume it also carries the force of a mental discipline. Attention moves through that title toward habitation, ascent, and rule, and the conjunction of those terms already suggests the difficult labor by which lived experience seeks shape. Such pressure bears with special force upon Yeats, whose later poetry pursues form under conditions of inward and historical intensity. Age has entered the body with full authority, public life has entered the imagination, memory has acquired structural weight, and history has assumed an active presence within the field of thought. One encounters in The Tower, accordingly, a body of work in which inward conflict enters material form and achieves rhythmic control through a style capable of sustaining tension without surrendering shape. At the threshold, I want to suggest a central claim. The Tower is a book preoccupied with structures that hold strain, and its deepest interest lies in the kinds of authority that remain available when inherited supports have entered weakness, when private life and public crisis occupy the same imaginative chamber, and when art answers conditions that exceed the reach of remedy. Yeats's Tower, therefore, matters as more than picturesque setting, for it stands as the sign of a mind engaged in the effort of gathering itself under pressure and converting that pressure into form. The value of beginning here lies in the way the Tower presents sovereignty as an active question within poetic life. The poems return repeatedly to the problem of how a self might assume form while carrying fracture within it, and how style might achieve command while keeping faith with suffering, humiliation, and historical violence as lived conditions of consciousness. What emerges through that sustained effort is a poetry of endurance, shaped intensity, and disciplined force. With that in view, I turn now to The Tower itself, to its poems, its architecture, and its vision of the divided soul. What sort of sovereignty can an old poet claim when the body enters its season of diminishment, the nation emerges from revolution only to wound itself in civil strife, and the mind, still hungry for form, order, or authority, finds every earthly dwelling already cracked by time? That is the question I place at the threshold of Yeats's The Tower. The book appeared in 1928, its title arising from the Norman Tower House at bodily in County Galway. Yeats had bought and restored this building, which became both habitation and emblem in his mature work. Critics and biographers alike have long treated the volume as one of the great summits of his late career. With reason, it gathers poems such as Sailing to Byzantium, The Tower, Meditations in Time of Civil War, 1919, and Among School Children. In these works, private age, public violence, and symbolic architecture meet metaphysical ambition within a single chamber, where they resist a peaceful settlement. A tower rises from the Irish ground with an ambiguity Yeats preserves. Stone carries weight, just as this material sustains memory. Such masonry serves as a refuge or a monument. The structure appears as a wound in the landscape, a boast against flux, or a relic of conquest. It signifies a rootedness won through appropriation, acting as a theatrical prop in the soul's long argument with mutability. Though a bodily, the material structure behind the symbolic one entered Yeats's life in 1916 for a small purchase price, then underwent restoration under his direction. The Tower stood near Coole Park, Lady Gregory's estate, close to one of the great emotional and imaginative centres of his adult life. He lived there with Georgie Hyde Lees and their children through much of the 1920s. A 15th-century tower house thus became, in modern Ireland, the chosen dwelling of a poet already deep in self-mythologizing maturity. Yet the building survives as something beyond a biographical curiosity. It becomes the visible form of a spiritual predicament. The poet enters a tower so that the tower may enter the poet. Thus, my lecture begins at the crossing between masonry and inwardness, for the tower is a book obsessed with shapes that hold pressure. Yeats had reached the age at which style either thins into repetition or hardens into a personal necessity. Well, then you would expect hardness was his choice. The early dream mists had given way by this phase to a poetry of cut stone, hammered metal, or bone. It features the stare and the winding gyre, old rage and exacting self-accusation, along with a proud theatrical gesture. Even when he speaks of transcendence, he speaks through crafted matter. Gold, mosaic, and the tower stair provide the ground, while the carved image stands near the schoolroom floor. The chestnut tree and the swan's wing, the ruined house and the broken wall, the late poems keep returning to things made, built, or struck. They focus on objects mounted or inherited. One feels a man who doubts vapor unless it has first passed through ordeal. That transformation in Yeats's manner has often been narrated as the movement from Celtic twilight toward hard modern sovereignty. The phrase is useful only if one preserves its tension. Yeats maintains symbol and myth, ritual and occult order, or visionary recurrence. These elements submit to a new discipline. He wants the supernatural to have a local habitation in syntax. The man seeks transcendence to show its joints. Mastery requires metaphysics to climb a stair that has chipped under centuries of weather and usage. That, to my mind, explains why the tower carries such weight. A tower is vertical aspiration under the sign of historical residue. It lifts itself from a ground it must always occupy. The stone remains local, the desire turns upward. The title poem, The Tower, stages this predicament with startling candor. Old age arrives there to displace saintly serenity and domestic diminishment. Yeats grants it anger and embarrassment, appetite and grotesquerie, or comic violence alongside bitter intellectual pride. Lust continues to press upon the consciousness of the aging speaker, while revulsion at that same appetite rises alongside it, and Yeats converts both impulses into material for a rhetoric of extraordinary force and pressure. Fleshly decline has already entered the poem as a felt betrayal, yet that betrayal does not diminish the reach of the mind. It drives the imagination toward a more exacting symbolic ambition, as though the failing body compels the poet to seek in form a power that nature has begun to withdraw. Nothing in the poem permits the easy fiction that art abolishes decay, for the injury remains present and active within every gesture of transcendence. Where a younger writer might have pursued solace or emotional settlement, Yeats turns instead toward mastery over contradiction itself, preferring the difficult authority that can be exercised within fracture to the thinner comfort of an untroubled but spiritually diminished repose. What shall I do with this absurdity, O heart, O troubled heart, this caricature, decrepit age that has been tied to me as to a dog's tail? Never had I more excited, passionate, fantastical imagination, nor an ear and eye that more expected the impossible, not in boyhood when with rod and fly, or the humbler worm, I climbed Ben Bulben's back and had the livelong summer day to spend. It seems that I must bid the muse go pack, choose Plato and Plotinus for a friend, until imagination, ear and eye, can be content with argument and deal in abstract things, or be derided by a sort of battered kettle at the heel. That is why sovereignty stands at the centre of any serious reading of the Tower. Yeats had already served as a senator of the Irish Free State in the 1920s. His poetry from the period bears the marks of a man who had watched a nation pass from anti-colonial struggle into internal fracture. Public authority, in his imagination, remained a concern of form and ceremony. Ceremony touched rank and memory, along with the right ordering of energies. In the political sphere, that instinct could yield aristocratic hauteur or sharp intelligence. That same drive might lead to cultural guardianship or grave blindness. In the poems, it yields a restless inquiry: who governs the self once inherited structures have crumbled? The question remains after youth has departed and the old symbols return like broken instruments. This inquiry persists once violence has entered the house. Failure may meet the state, flesh might also fail. The soul must either become its own architect or submit to dispersal. Yeats refuses dispersal. The The tower emerges as a figure of self-rule under conditions of sustained pressure, and the phrase requires its full political and spiritual weight to be heard if the argument of the tower is to come properly into view. In Yeats, self-rule carries an unmistakable national inflection, for the claim of inward sovereignty develops beside Ireland's own struggle to define and secure political sovereignty, while the poet, on a parallel plane, seeks a style disciplined enough to resist dilution, sentimentality, and the diminishment that follows from merely reactive politics. What comes into focus, then, is a governing ambition directed toward the soul itself. Yeats seeks an inward authority capable of ordering memory, eros, horror, and visionary longing within a single field of consciousness, granting each force its place without allowing any one of them to dissolve the whole into incoherence. The divided soul named in my title refers precisely to this state of inward contest and formal pressure. Yeats's life of mind in the tower is riven by the antagonism between body and intellect, while history presses continually against dream. Ireland stands in charged relation to Byzantium, and domestic habitation occupies the same imaginative structure as symbolic monument. Erotic life remains active beside senatorial authority. Personal memory meets civilizational inheritance in forms of friction that the poems neither disguise nor simplify. Christian residue, pagan recurrence, local stone, and abstract geometrical form all enter the same imaginative architecture. The greatness of the book lies in the severity with which it sustains these oppositions, refusing any easy settlement and drawing its authority from the disciplined endurance of contradiction. Let me remain for a moment with the bodily as an actual structure, for the material fact of the building keeps criticism answerable to history and prevents the symbol from floating free of the conditions that produced it. A Norman tower house in the west of Ireland holds within its masonry an archive of layered sovereignties carrying the marks of feudal order, colonizing power, fortified habitation, landholding, clan conflict, adaptation, and endurance in one dense historical form. When Yeats takes possession of it, he enters no innocent inheritance. He chooses instead to dwell within a built remnant of history, and, in making it serve as a personal emblem, accepts the burden of inhabiting a structure already charged with political ambiguity. The transformation is central to the poem's symbolic force. A fortress becomes a dwelling, a defensive structure becomes a lyric observatory, yet the older meanings continue to exert pressure through the change, so that the tower derives its imaginative authority from a sedimented reality that exceeds the poet's design. Stone remembers more than Yeats intends, and the building preserves within itself a history larger, older, and less tractable than any private mythology he might wish to impose upon it. The stair within such a tower carries a gravity equal to that of the walls, for Yeats's imagination is drawn persistently to spirals, gyres, circling movements, and returns that become forms of departure at the very moment they seem to repeat themselves. The spiral stair offers a sensory enactment of that metaphysical habit of mind. Ascent proceeds through turning, height is gained by circling a fixed center, and the climber advances along a winding path whose very shape denies the fantasy of direct, linear elevation. In that sense, the architecture of the building comes into intimate contact with the architecture of a vision, although the tower in the poems always exceeds any schematic paraphrase of doctrine. Spiral movement becomes, in this body of work, a way of thinking historical recurrence, personal memory, spiritual transformation, and artistic labor together, as though the soul itself could only rise by submitting to repetition, altered through each return. Yeats therefore imagines inward life as something other than a march toward conclusion. It proceeds by winding, by turning upon what it seeks to surpass, and by discovering that vision itself emerges through recurrence charged with difference. This winding motion prevents the tower from settling into a simple symbol of mastery, for a staircase that circles carries within its very design a discipline of limitation and a form of humility that any adequate reading must take seriously. Each ascent involves enclosure, partial sight interruption, the withdrawal of horizon, and a continuing dependence upon the wall the climber seeks to rise beyond, so that elevation takes shape through pressure, discipline, and constraint. Stone remains close to the body, the shoulder feels it, the turn submits to it, and the movement upward proceeds through constraint. The straight stair suggests the open ceremonial logic of a palace, whereas a spiral stair belongs to fortification, defense, old engineering, narrow passage, and secrecy, all of which give ascent a more exacting character. Height in such a structure is gained by turning against stone, and the image suits Yeats's late style precisely because it binds aspiration to resistance, vision to confinement, and formal elevation to physical effort. Sailing to Byzantium stages a desire for artifice, although that familiar description grasps only the most immediate surface of the poem's ambition. The poem certainly sets sensual and generative life against monuments of unaging intellect, and imagines a post-natural mode of being fashioned in the manner of a golden artifact, yet its deepest force lies less in the credibility of that achieved condition than in the violence and intensity of the longing directed toward it. An old man seeks admission to an order in which form might outlast organic decay, where the soul could find its singing masters, and where heart, body, appetite, mortality, and historical time might be transmuted into crafted permanence. What gives the poem its abiding power is the fact that such longing never loses its recognizably human sound. The speaker may seek release from nature, yet the cry itself remains the utterance of a creature at the furthest edge of embodied extremity. Artifice therefore bears the pressure of passion throughout, and the imagined escape into permanence derives its force from the mortal urgency it can never wholly leave behind. Now shall I make my soul, compelling it to study in a learned school, till the wreck of body, slow decay of blood, testy delirium, or dull decrepitude, or what worse evil come, the death of friends, or death of every brilliant eye that made a catch in the breath, seem but the clouds of the sky when the horizon fades, or a bird's sleepy cry among the deepening shades. Byzantium forms a counter-architecture to bodily, for the two sites embody opposed yet mutually sustaining orders within Yeats's imagination. The Irish tower belongs to rough stone, local weather, historical residue, and ancestral entanglement, whereas Byzantium appears in the register of gold, mosaic, perfected artifice, and sacred geometry. One rises from the earth and remains marked by the contingencies of place, the other gleams as though lifted above locality into a realm of formal permanence. Yet Yeats never simply abandons the first in pursuit of the second. The dream of Byzantium is written from within the pressure of Irish stone, and that fact has large interpretive consequence, because the ideal city of art remains intelligible only through the poet's continued immersion in age, nation, family, and the concrete circumstances of local dwelling. The divided soul, therefore, cannot rest wholly within either architecture. It must move between them, carrying the burden of each into the presence of the other. And it is precisely this traffic between rough habitation and perfected form that generates the peculiar voltage of the late style. Among school children intensifies the problem by placing Yeats within a schoolroom where public office, bodily age, remembered love, philosophical inquiry, biological fact, maternal flesh, and pedagogy all enter the same scene. The poem asks, with unusual persistence, how unity can be thought under the pressure of reflection, where body and soul, labour and form, and dancer and dance appear at once as distinct terms and as realities that resist final separation. What the poem tests is the ancient philosophical temptation to divide life into discrete essences, even as it presses toward a more difficult apprehension of wholeness. Its famous conclusion does not erase division through a sentimental fusion. Instead, it names an achieved form in which process and shape become indistinguishable, so that sovereignty comes to mean something more exacting than command by force. In this poem, sovereignty signifies the ordering of multiplicity into living form, a condition in which difference remains active, yet finds its place within a pattern capable of sustaining life without mutilating it into abstraction. I am drawn to the way public authority contracts before ontological bewilderment, so that the senator may enter the schoolroom in his civic capacity, while the metaphysician departs from it in a state of perplexed inquiry. Yeats surveys children, nuns, philosophers, mothers, old age, beauty, labour, and natural growth, and from that convergence there emerges a vision in which the categories by which modern consciousness ordinarily arranges experience begin to lose their hard separations. Among school children belongs centrally in the tower, because it asks what kind of architecture could house a life without violating its integrity through premature division. The schoolhouse orders bodies, the Senate orders civic speech, the tower orders symbolic inwardness, yet the chestnut tree and the dancer gesture toward another mode of order, one organic and formal at once. Sovereignty, in that larger sense, lies in a being's accomplished pattern and finds expression through an achieved form of life, while the divided soul longs for such a condition even as it apprehends it only in brief and difficult flashes. Meditations in time of civil war brings political and symbolic registers into immediate contact by writing from within the trauma that followed Irish independence, when conflict over treaty, legitimacy, violence, and national futurity turned Irish against Irish. The sequence places the poet in the tower as the country convulses around him, and the house becomes, through that placement, an observatory of fracture within history itself. The tower functions here as a concrete symbol, standing amid gunfire, reprisals, burned houses, broken inheritances, and the bitter knowledge that national liberation has issued into internecine bloodshed. Yeats neither dissolves politics into symbolism nor permits symbolism to shrink into mere reportage. Instead, he allows each register to contaminate the other, so that private dwelling, historical violence, and imaginative form enter the same structure of perception and remain there under unresolved pressure. One must register the scale of that achievement if the sequence is to be read with full seriousness, for Yeats places a real Irish conflict within the field of poetic consciousness and records the terrible moment at which inherited ideals have passed over into murderous action. The tower becomes, under that pressure, a vantage from which disintegration may be witnessed, and its height grants perspective only by exposing the limits of what such perspective can do. From that elevated position Yeats contemplates swans, trees, building, ancestry, ceremony, and withdrawal, yet the sequence persistently denies the fantasy that retreat into symbolic architecture could remain morally innocent while the nation convulses below. The question therefore presses with unusual force: by what right does a poet continue to keep house with forms while the country burns? Yeats answers only indirectly, though the answer is clear enough in its terms, for such a right can be sustained solely when form ceases to be an ornament of detachment and becomes instead a severe mode of witnessing equal to the historical emergency confronts. That distinction marks the work throughout. Yeats often sounds proud, aloof, aristocratic in bearing, and self-dramatizing in voice, yet the strongest poems in the volume earn that hauteur only by placing it in real jeopardy, allowing the tower's promise of distance to be broken open again and again by exposures the speaker cannot master at will. Age humiliates him, desire brings shame, public catastrophe overtakes him, memory resists discipline, philosophy reaches its limit, and violence strips rhetoric of any easy claim to nobility. Precisely at that point, where pride encounters exposure and formal command is forced to endure what it cannot govern, the voice rises into greatness. Yeats's sovereignty remains, therefore, an embattled performance of form held in the face of fracture, deriving its authority through the disciplined bearing of division and through a style that gives structure to what it sustains. 1919 unfolds as a historical elegy in which violence and beauty inhabit the same field of vision, while inherited order appears beside the swift conversion of treasure into wreckage. The divided soul rises here as a diagnosis of modernity itself, for culture gathers artifacts, stories, forms, and ideals into structures of value, even as history moves across them with a force that reveals their mortal condition. Sturdy stone enters the same world as fragile making, and national crisis assumes the scale of civilizational instability, so that Yeats's late mind moves continually between Ireland and the epoch, between the local event and the wider pattern of cyclical history. A wound in the lane thus acquires a larger significance, carrying within its immediacy a rupture in the order of things and allowing the poem to read a moment of Irish devastation as part of a broader crisis in the inheritance of civilization. That movement proceeds through the theory of the gyres, whose image of opposing spirals gives structural force to the drama of the tower. Yeats imagines history as patterned recurrence, with phases marked by expansion and contraction, with antithetical energies meeting primary ones, and with one civilization passing into the form of its successor through a law of historical transformation. Readers may approach the system through varying degrees of ascent, yet its dramatic power within the poetry remains unmistakable, for the spiral gives Yeats gains through the spiral, a way of thinking dividedness as movement in active form. Opposing forces interpenetrate, yield place to one another, and generate the very motion through which history and inward life become intelligible. The soul, within this design, turns upon a centre that draws it onward as an object of desire and orientation, so that recurrence itself becomes the means by which divided consciousness seeks form. That insight returns us to sovereignty. A sovereign self gains shape through the formal bearing of division. The tower stands while the stair wins, and the climber rises by turning within the very wall that confines him. Every window opens toward the sky. The whole structure thus becomes an emblem of disciplined contradiction. From a distance, its silhouette appears singular and declarative. From within, the structure reveals itself as a labor of angles, steps, blind curves, narrowed passages, and sudden openings. Yeats's late poetry resembles that interior experience. Readers may remember the lofty emblem, yet the actual experience of the poems unfolds as a repeated negotiation between enclosure and prospect. Age sharpens every one of these tensions. The Tower is a book about old age refusing decorous submission to decline. Yeats rejects the sentimental script in which aging yields sweetness or resignation. Lust persists, vanity remains active, and theatrical ambition continues to animate the self. Resentment survives beside a hunger for praise, while memory retains its sensuous force. The elderly self in these poems exists as a divided sovereignty, at once commanding and ridiculous, wounded and aspiring, yet still desirous of public form. That honesty gives the book much of its force, for Yeats compels the humiliations of the body to serve a final magnificence of utterance. Strange, but the man who made the song was blind. Yet now I have considered it, I find that nothing strange. The tragedy began with Homer that was a blind man, and Helen has all living hearts betrayed. Oh, may the moon and sunlight seem one inextricable beam, for if I triumph I must make men mad. And I myself created Hanrahan, and drove him drunk or sober through the dawn from somewhere in the neighbouring cottages. Caught by an old man's juggleries, he stumbled, tumbled, fumbled to and fro, and had but broken knees for hire and horrible splendour of desire. I thought it all out 20 years ago. One can see the same pattern in the volume's handling of women, for the late Yeats returns to Maud Gonne, to youthful beauty, to maternal imagery, and to erotic or legendary feminine presences that carry sustained imaginative force throughout the book. These figures enter some passages under the pressure of objectification. Elsewhere, their presence unsettles the symbolic economy through which he seeks to contain them. Feminine presences thus become thresholds between incarnate life and ideal form, incarnating beauty, reproduction, historical action, mother love, political myth, and metaphysical temptation within a single imaginative field. The divided soul approaches them in search of revelation and encounters an intensified division through the conversion of desire into history, of memory into loss, and of ideal beauty into decay. Through that movement, the male voice reveals its dependence upon what it holds at a distance, drawing energy, knowledge, and disturbance from the very figures whose alterity gives the poems much of their dramatic pressure. Leda and the Swan condenses that dependence into a scene of exceptional violence and consequence, where the mythic rape unfolds into Troy Agamemnon, catastrophe, heroic order, and the eventual emergence of a ruined order from the originating act. Yeats stages here the relation between force and revelation, joining embodiment to political consequence and presenting sovereignty as an unstable and searching question. What power governs the body at the moment history enters it? Then what authority presides over a civilization born through assault? The poem presents power in a form stripped of moral purity and deprived of settled legitimacy, while stony order appears in charged relation to eruptive violence, with every order carrying within itself some buried violence awaiting expression. Now let us pause here for a moment and think of Yeats's relation to Ireland, for Ireland in these poems remains an active and shaping presence whose force enters every major pressure of the volume. The bond at issue exceeds public allegiance and enters the texture of memory, habit, artistic formation, and emotional inheritance. In autobiographies, Yeats recalls that, in the family imagination, Sligo was more beautiful than other places, a phrase that shows how Ireland first came to him through intimate domestic speech and through his mother's stories of Ross's Point and Sligo life, long before it hardened into cultural programme or national emblem. Later, when he remembered the making of the Lake Isle of Innisfree, he traced the poem to a moment of homesickness in London, hearing a little tinkle of water in a shop window fountain and suddenly recovering lake water in memory. The poem, in that account, rises from visceral recall and local attachment, which gives the west of Ireland a place in his imagination deeper than scenery and nearer to psychic origin. The Ireland of the Tower, therefore, gathers more than patriotic feeling. It includes the west of Ireland, the early Free State, the Civil War landscape, the Anglo-Irish inheritance, and the cultural labour of the Irish literary revival. all of which converge in a poetry that turns local material into archetypal drama while keeping the local grain vivid within the larger design. Yeats himself understood his achievement in collective terms. In his Nobel lecture he described the honor as in some degree the symbol of a movement, a remark that reveals how closely he bound personal vocation to Ireland's artistic self-making. Examples from his life sharpen that relation. His first long stay at Coole Park in 1897 became formative for the Irish dramatic movement itself, for there, with Lady Gregory and Edward Martin, he helped devise plans for a native theatre, so that Irish place passed directly into Irish institution. Coole thus served as one of the chief centres of his adult imagination and gave durable form to his sense that Irish cultural life might be renewed through place, patronage, dramatic art, and historical memory. Such details illuminate the peculiar force with which Ireland enters the poems, not as a passive backdrop, nor as a mere repository of national sentiment, but as lived terrain, remembered sound, collaborative labour, and interior geography. The result can assume a high rhetorical register. At its strongest, it gives modern poetry a style in which national history and metaphysical hunger inhabit the same sentence and derive force from their mutual presence. Such doubleness explains why the tower can signify both Irish rootedness and the desire for transhistorical form. In one movement it stands as Yeats's chosen place in the Irish ground, answering displacement through a hereditary fantasy fashioned amid colonial residue and modern unrest. In another, the same structure becomes the launch point for a flight toward Byzantium, where sacred artifice, ritual order, and geometrical recurrence offer another mode of permanence. The contradiction remains fruitful through its persistence. Ireland itself carried divisions of folklore and state, peasant ground and aristocratic house, revolutionary aspiration and civil order, mythic antiquity and modern violence, and Yeats inhabited those pressures with unusual intensity. His relation to Ireland was therefore intimate, symbolic, contested, and historically dense at once, and the strength of the tower lies in the way it preserves that complexity instead of reducing the nation to a backdrop for private vision. The question of class remains integral to the argument, for Yeats's attraction to towers, senatorship, ancestral forms, and aristocratic bearing belongs to a social imagination in which order appears through hierarchy, splendour gathers around rank, and cultural seriousness depends upon disciplined elites. The pressure of that association is real. A sound reading understands it as a conviction that form requires guardianship, ceremony, and inherited structures capable of sustaining value across time. Within that imaginative order, Yeats conceives the soul as something requiring aristocratic discipline, with discipline and bearing providing the inner spine through which form acquires authority and through which the claims of shapelessness meet a firm and deliberate refusal. The tower serves as a school of stance, teaching verticality through the habits it imposes upon the body and the mind. It asks the inhabitant to climb, to withdraw, to look out, to guard, and to order interior space with deliberate concentration, while the contrast between a sprawling house and a tower clarifies the matter further. A broad dwelling diffuses attention, whereas the tower gathers it. Room rises above room. A single stair provides the means of passage, and a single entry leads toward a single vantage, so that Yeats's late poems come to share precisely that concentration. They move along a narrow course, ascend through turns, and carry each pressure into the next chamber of thought, where desire gives way to philosophy. History assumes the shape of symbol, and symbol brings the mind back to this tangible embarrassment of physicality. A towered intelligence, in that sense, thinks in stacked rooms. Such stacking produces the strong rhetorical architecture of the volume. Yeats's stanzas often feel like stories, each bearing a local pressure before yielding upward into the next level of thought, while his syntax pivots with remarkable authority between colloquial sharpness and liturgical cadence, between savage compression and ceremonial conclusion. The sovereign voice governs tone throughout, admitting the grotesque while preserving dignity and receiving philosophical abstraction while sustaining dramatic edge. Within the same movement, the poetry travels from school children to Plato, from a staircase to eternity, and from swans over water to musket fire, yet the voice retains its full identity through every shift of register. In the tower, Yeats reaches that degree of command repeatedly, and Britannica's judgment carries real justice. Before me floats an image, man or shade, shade more than man, more image than a shade. For Hades, bobbin bound in mummy cloth, may unwind the winding path, a mouth that has no moisture and no breath breathless mouths may summon. I hail the superhuman. I call it death in life and life in death. Perfection in this book includes fracture, and the point deserves sustained emphasis because incompletion provides the very ground upon which the monument rises. Old age remains present as an unresolved condition. History carries its own internal fractures. The dream of Byzantium continues as an aspirational horizon, and the gyres offer pattern while mystery retains its force. Erotic memory remains active, public authority persists under the sign of compromise, and even the tower as symbol carries division within itself, holding fortification and prison, rootedness and isolation, aristocratic claim and vulnerable exposure within one charged structure. The greatness of the book depends upon Yeats's willingness to inhabit those fissures ceremonially, giving them form, cadence, and intellectual pressure through a style that derives authority from sustained contact with division. I find that the tower offers an especially sharp emblem of this condition, for its movement resembles a mind climbing within its own image and discovering, at each turn, another chamber of inward difficulty. The poet considers old age, memory, lust, folly, wisdom, art, and legendary figures that refract his divided condition through a rhetoric at once muscular, visionary, and impatient with sentiment. One hears a man contending with time, and one hears within the same utterance a man seeking to extract authority from the very experience of diminished power. That paradox stands at the center of the poem's force, because every reduction in carnal obedience increases the labor that form must perform, until poetry itself becomes a compensatory sovereignty through which life's diminishment compels art to bear what flesh can no longer carry with ease. The tower belongs to a wider modernist concern with the creation of durable form after the collapse of inherited certainties, and Yeats answers that concern through emblematic concentration, symbolic architecture, recurrence, chant, ritual image, and severe stanzaic control. He seeks a poetry that stands like a building, weathered by history yet internally ordered, and that impulse gives the book its distinctive sculptural quality. Even individual poems seem carved, as though verbal texture had passed through pressure, incision, and shaping force before reaching the page. The line often strikes the ear with the impact of a chisel meeting dressed stone, and the comparison clarifies the nature of Yeats's achievement, for sound, structure, and intellectual design converge in a poetry that feels built as much as written. The tower carries real force, yet the horizon continues to hold Byzantium, and the continuing presence of that city of artifice reveals the finite reach of the local emblem. Though a bodily houses, the poet grants perspective upon Irish violence and dramatizes rootedness, while eternity, history, and corporeal decay maintain their own claims and thus press the divided soul toward a second architecture set above historical weather. Yeats's genius appears in the discipline with which he keeps that second architecture from sinking into easy consolation, for Byzantium arrives in the poems as a radiant order touched also by coldness and impersonality, so that the movement toward release from mutability carries with it a surrender of creaturely warmth. The poems possess full knowledge of that cost, and their power derives in large measure from the grave lucidity with which they sustain the attraction of transcendence together with the human price exacted by its imagined fulfillment. A straddle on the dolphin's mire and blood, spirit after spirit. The smithies break the flood, the golden smithies of the emperor. Marbles of the dancing floor break, bitter furies of complexity, those images that yet fresh images beget, that dolphin torn, that gong-tormented sea. Knowledge returns us to the body, for an old man exists as mind within body, as body among younger bodies, and as a consciousness carrying the memory of former desire together with the felt experience of present diminishment. Public life and private life alike admit humiliation into that condition, and Yeats writes its pressure with a ferocity that keeps these passages dramatically alive. The body gives the poems their living tension. A soul fastened to a dying animal longs for song study, holy fire, and crafted permanence, and the phrase shocks by making metaphysical aspiration arise through biological distress. The tower therefore houses a climbing body, while the spiral belongs to knees, breath, balance, fatigue, and touch, so that symbol retains its living bond with physiology. The architecture of the tower carries division because the soul it houses is incarnate. Yeats can imagine unaging intellect, golden artifice, and formal completion, yet human life unfolds in perishing matter, and his greatness lies in allowing that shock to become style. Flesh enters the work under the discipline of transfiguration through form, while form itself continues to bear the memory of its origin in vulnerability. That relation explains the durable power of the poems for readers whose distance from his system's politics or social instincts remains fully intact, because beneath the pageantry there persists a human crisis concerning the habitation of age, memory, public disaster, and mortal embodiment under the continuing demand for shape. One answer appears in the relation between ruin and making. Towers weather, houses burn, states fracture, and youth departs. Yet the poems themselves stand as acts of remaking through which Yeats writes from within dissolution toward architectonic order. The sovereignty he discovers is artistic in character and takes its place before the political or metaphysical claim enters full view. A poem can hold what the state lets fall. A stanza can balance antagonisms that history tears apart. A sequence can witness civil violence while sustaining a disciplined reserve toward total adjudication. Art thus becomes a counterpolity in which divided energies receive provisional form, and Yeats's forms, for all their authority, remain mortal artifacts that stand against time while continuing to dwell within time's dominion. The volume's power arises through this doubleness. The Tower stands deep in Ireland, inseparable from place, the Free State moment, Yeats's cultural nationalism, the history of bodily, and the aftermath of the Civil War, while also entering a larger order in which Ireland becomes the ground upon which ancient questions of form, violence, old age, eros, and historical recurrence come into view with unusual clarity. Through that union, the book enters the company of world literature while preserving its local grain, so that Irish stone, a Galway stair, and symbols ascending toward Byzantium all continue to carry the smell of river, wall, timber, and weathered lime. A lecture on the Tower ought to acknowledge the danger that attends admiration too easily surrendered to Yeats's rhetoric of sovereignty, for authority in this volume possesses a genuine power of seduction and can lead readers toward assent at points where interrogation would better serve both poem, critic. Command enters the ear with such force that it may assume the aspect of truth itself. Yet the poems frequently carry within their own movement the corrective that criticism requires, exposing vanity, dramatizing self-division, and placing each gesture of mastery in close relation to comedy, desire, mortality, and moral uncertainty. Pride belongs to the Tower, yet loneliness belongs to it as well, for high vantage grants sight together with separation, and the sovereign soul may discover itself within a condition of magnificent isolation whose ache runs beneath even the most triumphal cadences. Isolation may indeed provide the hidden architecture of the book, because the Tower separates the poet from the plain. Age places distance between the self and the young. Public office sets the senator apart. Artistic vocation removes the maker from ordinary satisfactions. Visionary aspiration subjects the soul to austere discipline. Civil war divides citizens, and the gyre itself distributes historical phases into distinct formations. Out of these separations, Yeats seeks a form strong enough to hold divided things in stable relation, so that sovereignty comes to signify a composed bearing capable of sustaining pressure, distance, and inward division within a single achieved shape. Composed bearing explains why the later Yeats can feel at once ancient and modern, for he writes with full knowledge of inherited forms, invoking myth, philosophy, ritual, and emblem within a world in which inheritance passes into value only through renewed labor under historical strain. The poetry arises after rupture, amid the debris of political idealism, within a modern crisis of authority, and under the pressure of age and self-consciousness, so that his answer takes shape through construction. He builds with old stone under modern pressure. That is the essential lesson of the Tower, where architecture assumes a central place as the chosen mode through which a divided soul becomes legible to itself. I return to the title Stone, Spiral, and Sovereignty. Within that triad, stone denotes endurance, spiral traces movement, sovereignty imposes the demand that life assume shape and bearing. These terms carry their full force only in concert. Stone apart from spiral yields monumentality, dead weight, and static pride. Spiral apart from stone yields abstraction, occult drift, and detached pattern. Sovereignty apart from both yields rhetoric suspended above its own ground. The Tower matters with such force because it binds the three within a single imaginative structure, making a dwelling of conflict and giving division a staircase. The initial question thus finds its answer. What sort of sovereignty can an old poet claim when body and nation alike enter crisis, and when metaphysical certainty itself has passed into a condition of strain? Yeats's answer in the Tower is severe, for the poem moves within a world from which innocence, peace, youthful power, and unbroken civic order have already withdrawn, leaving form as the chief remaining ground of authority. A tower built from historical residue supplies the habitation, a spiral ascent converts division into movement, an erotic shame senatorial witness, civilizational grief, and transfiguring desire all enter the same ordered structure. The soul remains divided, and that division continues in active force to the end, yet under Yeats's hand it passes into form. There lies his mature sovereignty, a sovereignty that exercises rule through the shaping of what it bears.